It begins with a shift so subtle that ancient people never recorded it, yet so powerful that it reshaped civilization. The moment humans realized that the forces guiding their lives were no longer distant storms or silent mountains. They were reflections of themselves. For tens of thousands of years, belief had been a response to fear. Ice Age hunters prayed to fire, rivers, and the sky because these were the forces that decided survival. But when the ice melted and humans built the first permanent villages, everything changed. For the first time, people stayed in one place long enough to observe patterns. Floods returned on schedule. Stars rose in the same season. Harvests followed the same moon. Nature was no longer chaos. It had rules. And once humans recognized rules, they began searching for the rulemaker. But the answers they found did not come from the sky. They came from themselves. Between 9000 and 5000 BCE, as farming villages spread across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, social life became more complex than anything hunter-gatherers had experienced. Sharing water, storing grain, resolving conflicts, managing resources. The greatest challenge was no longer the wild outside, but the people inside the community. A wind spirit could not settle a dispute over irrigation. A river goddess could not decide who owned a field. A storm deity could not judge theft or betrayal. People needed gods who understood intention, justice, promises, responsibility. In other words, gods who behaved like humans. Archaeology captures this transformation clearly. In some of the earliest temples of Eridu, and later in Uruk, statues evolve from abstract shapes into recognizably human forms. Wide eyes. Folded hands. Detailed hair and clothing. By the late Ubad period, gods had personalities. Enki was wise. Inanna was passionate and strategic. Enlil was powerful but unpredictable. These were not forces of nature anymore. They were models of social behavior. In Anatolia, at Çatalhöyük, the sacred moved inside the home. Walls showed scenes of birth, death, hunting, protection. Clay figurines of powerful mothers and guardians were found beneath hearths. Spiritual meaning did not live above the village. It lived inside daily life. In Egypt, the shift became foundational. Horus was not just a falcon. He was the rightful heir, the embodiment of kingship. Isis was a mother who protected her child. Osiris died and rose again like the Nile itself. Their myths explained the world because they mirrored human experience. This change was not poetic. It was structural. Once gods had thoughts, humans needed laws. Once gods had emotions, humans had morality. Once gods cared, societies needed order. Anthropomorphic deities allowed communities to create rules rooted in meaning, not fear. To define fairness. To justify leadership. To explain why actions mattered beyond survival. This was the intellectual breakthrough of early civilization. Religion stopped being a way to interpret weather. It became a way to interpret people. And once gods looked and thought like humans, they no longer lived only in storms or mountains. They needed places, structures, centers where memory, ritual, food storage, astronomy, and authority could merge into one system. The first temples. These buildings would soon become the engines of coordination and control. The early blueprint of government, economy, and law. But before temples could rise, gods had to change. And they did, the moment humans saw themselves in the divine. That shift was only the beginning. Because once belief took human form, society itself would be rebuilt around it. Once gods began to look and think like humans, belief could no longer remain scattered across hills, hearths, and stories. It needed a place to concentrate. A structure where ritual, memory, and management could merge into something larger than any one family or clan. That structure was the temple. And it would become the most powerful invention of the early human world. The earliest temples were modest. A raised platform in a small Ubaid village. A single room built above a marsh in Eridu. Simple, yet their placement mattered. They stood at the center, not the edge. People built their homes around them, not the other way around. This tells us something crucial. The temple was never only spiritual. It was organizational. Archaeology confirms this through the layers of Eridu, 18 temples stacked one atop another across 1,000 years, each new building slightly larger, slightly more complex, slightly more central to community life. What people rebuilt again and again reveals what they believed was essential. Inside these early sanctuaries, researchers found clay bowls, offerings, tokens, and storage spaces. Not treasures of worship, but tools of administration. The temple was becoming the village's memory. As societies scaled, the functions concentrated there went far beyond prayer. Temples measured water levels in canals. They tracked the timing of floods. They organized labor for irrigation and harvest. They stored grain collected from surrounding households. They redistributed food during shortages. They oversaw rituals that united hundreds of people in shared identity. In a world without writing, this was the only system capable of keeping a community aligned. Priests were not simply spiritual figures. They were early scientists, engineers, and accountants. They read the stars because the stars predicted seasons. They performed rituals because rituals synchronized work. They recorded grain through tokens because tokens ensured fairness. These roles created authority that no hunter-gatherer leader had ever held. A priest was not strong because he fought predators. He was strong because he managed time. In Sumerian myth, the gods grant kingship and order to humans. But history suggests the reverse. Humans created institutions that needed divine legitimacy to function. Temples allowed that. As settlements grew into proto-cities, the scale of coordination expanded. At places like Tel Alubat, Tel Mashnaka, and early Uruk, temple districts included workshops, granaries, courtyards, and storage platforms. Artisans produced goods for ritual. Farmers deposited grain as tax. Specialists cataloged offerings, tools, and labor contributions. The temple was becoming an economy. But it also became something else. A stabilizer. Agriculture created both abundance and vulnerability. A sudden drought could starve a community. A failed flood could empty granaries. Temples responded with ceremonies that reinforced trust when conditions turned unstable. The ritual calendar acted as psychological infrastructure. It kept fear from dissolving cooperation. Anthropologists call this the emergence of collective order. Not enforced by weapons, but sustained through shared meaning. And meaning needed a house. By 4500 BCE, the temple was no longer a building. It was the central nervous system of early civilization. A place where belief, labor, astronomy, surplus, and myth fused into one coherent system. The divine had taken shape. Now society took shape around it. This shift did more than organize resources. It established a pattern that every future civilization would copy. A sacred center, a managing elite, and a population that saw obedience as part of cosmic balance. Temples had become engines, not only of worship, but of predictability, coordination, and control. And soon, as their power expanded, something even more transformative would emerge from within their walls: the first laws. As temples grew into engines of coordination, they began shaping something even more powerful than agriculture or ritual. They shaped rules. In early farming villages, conflict was inevitable. Who owns the canal? Who planted first? Who owes grain after a poor harvest? Who repairs the levee when the river breaks? These problems were too complex for custom alone. Communities needed a system that people trusted, even when outcomes were painful. The temple offered exactly that, authority backed not by force, but by the will of the gods. At first these rules were unwritten. A priest interpreted omens, weighed disputes, and made decisions that he claimed reflected divine intention. But because he stood at the center of ritual and survival, people believed him. Obedience was not submission to a person. It was alignment with cosmic order. This is the earliest root of law. Not punishment, but predictability. Archaeology shows the transition clearly. In sites like Tel Brak and Tepe Gora, researchers found administrative rooms filled with standardized containers, tokens, and measuring tools. These objects were not merely economic instruments. They enforced expectations. A full jar meant a full obligation. A missing token meant a broken promise. Before writing existed, law existed in material form. By 3500 BCE, Uruk took this system further than any place on Earth. The city was enormous for its time, a dense network of canals, workshops, and quarters feeding into the temple precinct. There, scribes began pressing marks into wet clay to record deliveries, rations, and duties. These were the first written symbols. They had nothing to do with storytelling. They were tools for accountability. When a scribe wrote down a number of grain jars owed, that number became binding. It was a contract, a proto-law. As writing matured, it changed everything. The authority of the temple no longer depended on memory or interpretation. It had evidence. A clay tablet could outlast the priest who wrote it. A rule could survive the person who declared it. For the first time in history, society had continuity independent of individuals. This shift created a new kind of power. The power to define right and wrong through permanent record. Early law codes emerged from this foundation. The Code of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, the Laws of Ishnana around 1900 BCE. And the most influential of all, the Stele of Hammurabi around 1750 BCE. These were not random lists of punishments. They were attempts to align human behavior with what people believed was the structure of the universe. Fair weights. Honest trade. Protection for widows and orphans. Consequences for harm and betrayal. Each rule was presented as a declaration from the gods, delivered through the king. Justice became cosmic. Obedience became sacred. But law also had a practical side. It created trust between strangers. It allowed trade to expand across regions. It reduced the need for constant negotiation. People no longer relied solely on reputation. They relied on written guarantees. This stability allowed cities to grow larger, wealth to concentrate, and political authority to harden. Law did not simply organize society. It reshaped power. The temple judges who once interpreted will of the gods became administrators of social order. The kings who presided over rituals became guardians of justice. The scribes who wrote numbers became architects of legal reasoning. Divine will had crystallized into regulation. Myth had become mechanism. Spiritual authority had turned into political structure. But a new tension appeared. Once rules were written, people could question whether those rules were fair. Once kings claimed divine authority, people could ask why the gods favored some and not others. The same system that created order also created inequality. And as cities expanded and rulers grew more ambitious, the divine face of law slowly transformed into something else. A tool. A justification. A way to legitimize hierarchy as destiny. That transformation would give rise to the most consequential shift yet. The moment when rulers stopped serving the gods and began claiming to embody them. As written law clarified responsibilities and enforced fairness, another force quietly expanded behind it. Authority. Not the authority of elders or skilled farmers, but the authority of those who controlled temples, writing, and ritual. Once divine order could be recorded, someone had to guard it. And that person, in every early city, became more than a leader. He became the voice of the gods. The transition began subtly. In early Mesopotamia, temple officials oversaw irrigation and grain storage because survival depended on it. But as the role grew, their decisions shaped every part of daily life. A single priest could determine when to plant, how much to store, who received support during famine. By mediating between the heavens and the fields, he gained a status no hunter-gatherer leader ever held. Over generations, that role hardened. The keeper of ritual became the keeper of order. And the keeper of order became ruler. In the cities of the Ubad and Uruk periods, archaeologists find houses larger than others, tools of administration, seals carved with symbols of authority. These were not military kings. They were priest kings. Their legitimacy came not from conquest, but from interpretation. They didn't claim to command the gods. They claimed the gods spoke through them. This idea changed everything. If a leader was chosen by heaven, then his decisions were not mere opinions. They were cosmic necessity. If he governed water distribution, he governed the balance of the world. If he judged disputes, he restored the universe to harmony. Opposing him meant opposing the divine. With this logic, hierarchy became sacred. Obedience became virtue. By the time Uruk reached its height around 3200 BCE, the fusion of temple and rulership was unmistakable. The massive Ina precinct served not only as a space for worship, but as an administrative heart. Tablets found their list: workers, rations, land allotments, and ceremonial duties. The temple had become government. The priest-king stood between cosmos and society. His authority was reinforced every dawn when sunlight illuminated the temple's upper terraces, a visual reminder that heaven touched earth through architecture and ritual. Egypt pushed this concept even further. Where Mesopotamian rulers claimed divine mandate, Egyptian pharaohs claimed divine identity. They were Horus in life, Osiris in death, sons of Ra by royal birth. This belief was not symbolic. It structured the entire kingdom. The pharaoh's body was a cosmic instrument. If he upheld justice, the Nile would flood. If he failed, the land would starve. His moral character was tied to the universe itself. This theological rulership produced stability unprecedented in the ancient world. No rebellion was merely political. It threatened the harmony of creation. Every victory confirmed divine favor. Every monument testified to eternal order. Yet such power carried consequences. As rulers elevated themselves toward heaven, the distance between them and ordinary people widened. Granaries became centralized. Land became institutional. Ritual became mandatory. The system that once coordinated communities transformed into a hierarchy that controlled them. Still, the people accepted it because the logic felt natural. The world had become more complex. Fields expanded. Trade networks stretched across mountains and deserts. Cities grew into tens of thousands. Someone had to maintain balance. Someone had to interpret the will of heaven. By wearing the face of a god, rulers gave society the illusion of certainty in an unpredictable world. But a deeper shift was already taking place beneath this structure. As rulers claimed divine authority, people began to look more closely at the gods themselves. These deities had emotions, conflicts, hopes, flaws. They loved and grieved. They punished and forgave. They looked like humans because humans had made them that way. And once people recognized this humanity in their gods, something profound began to emerge. A new question: if the divine could feel, desire, fail, or forgive, what did that say about human nature itself? That question would open the door to morality, conscience, and the first understanding of the inner life. As rulers claimed divine status and law was grounded in cosmic order, something unexpected began to happen. People didn't just obey their gods. They began to study them. In earlier ages, deities were forces of nature. A storm god punished, a river goddess nourished. Their behavior reflected the world outside. But once gods became human-shaped, they no longer represented rain or fire. They represented psychology. The divine world acquired emotions. In Mesopotamian myths, Enlil could be furious, impulsive, even destructive. Inanna could be strategic, loving, or vengeful, depending on the situation. Enki could be wise, forgiving, and playful. Each story reflected a tension familiar to every society: ambition, loyalty, betrayal, renewal. Mythology was no longer a weather report. It was a study of human character. Egyptian religion pushed this even further. Isis protected her child with fierce devotion. Osiris experienced death, dismemberment, resurrection, and judgment. Horus struggled with identity and rightful inheritance. These were not the dramas of natural forces. They were reflections of family, grief, justice, and the hope that wrongs could be set right. People listened to these stories not just during rituals, but during moments of uncertainty. A child lost a parent and saw Isis's mourning. A farmer faced injustice and recalled the weighing of the heart. A ruler hesitated in judgment and remembered the balance of math. Divinity had become a moral language. This shift also changed art. Gods were no longer abstract symbols carved vaguely into stone. They had eyes that watched, hands that held, faces that expressed fear, compassion, triumph. Temples displayed scenes of divine councils, sacred marriages, and cosmic trials because these mirrored the conflicts people faced in their own lives. The more human the gods became, the more their stories guided daily behavior. Anthropologists see this as the moment when religion turned inward. Instead of simply managing the natural world, belief began managing the inner world. Emotion, responsibility, conscience, and as the moral dimension grew, the structure of society changed with it. Communities began distinguishing between mistakes, intentional harm, and moral failure. Breaking a canal wall was not the same as lying. Stealing grain was not the same as dishonoring an oath. Early law codes reflect this shift: fines for accidents, harsher penalties for betrayal, restoration for unfair harm. Morality had become measurable. This internalization of ethics produced a new kind of authority: the judge, not the priest who interpreted omens, but a figure who evaluated intention, who decided whether an act aligned with truth or violated cosmic balance. This marked the birth of judicial culture, where society examined not only actions but motives. The gods did the same. In myths, they rewarded honesty, punished arrogance, and challenged deception. Their judgments created a moral universe parallel to the physical one. But this development also created tension. If gods behaved like humans, then their flaws became visible. If divine justice mirrored human justice, then people could question the fairness of their gods. And when they questioned their gods, they inevitably questioned the rulers who spoke in their name. This is the silent turning point embedded in every ancient civilization. The moment when belief becomes reflection, and reflection becomes doubt. Not destructive doubt, but curiosity. Why do gods feel jealousy? Why do they change their minds? Why do they punish some but forgive others? And what does that reveal about human nature? By giving the divine human emotions, early societies accidentally invited self-examination. People began to think about responsibility, choice, and the weight of consequence. They began to ask what made an action right or wrong, even when no ruler was watching. This shift did not weaken religion. It broadened it. Faith became a way to understand the human condition. Myth became a tool to explore identity. Ritual became a way to confront the uncertainties of the heart. But as inner life expanded, something else evolved with it: power. If morality mattered, then those who interpreted morality gained extraordinary influence. Priests and kings no longer just managed irrigation. They shaped conscience. They defined what was good and what was forbidden. They became guardians of not only the harvest, but the soul. And this development set the stage for the next great transformation. The moment when divinity and rulership fused completely. When kings no longer spoke for the gods, but claimed to embody them. And through that claim, they reshaped civilization in their own image. As gods became mirrors of human emotion and morality, rulers saw an opportunity that would transform the structure of civilization. If the divine behaved like humans, then humans could behave like the divine. And if gods judged intention, then those who interpreted intention could rule by more than authority. They could rule by destiny. This is the birth of political theology, when kingship ceased to be a role and became a cosmic identity. The logic was simple. If the universe ran on moral order, someone needed to uphold that order on earth. A priest could interpret divine will, but only a ruler could enforce it. Only a ruler could mobilize labor, secure borders, and oversee justice. Only a ruler could ensure harmony between heaven and society. In Mesopotamia, this idea took form early. The Ensi, or priest king, became the mediator between the gods and the city. His rituals opened the agricultural year. His decisions resolved disputes. His moral character was believed to influence rainfall, harvests, and even the city's fortune in war. The ruler was no longer powerful because he organized people. He organized people because he was powerful in the eyes of the gods. By the time Uruk reached its peak, the image of kingship had expanded beyond administration. Rulers stood at the center of festivals reenacting creation myths. They symbolically married the goddess Inanna to renew fertility and political legitimacy. Tablets depicted them receiving authority directly from the divine. Power was no longer practical. It was sacred. This transformation was even stronger in Egypt. Their kingship was not granted by heaven. It descended from heaven. The pharaoh was not the chosen of the gods. He was the divine embodied in flesh. Horus and life, Osiris and death. His heartbeat maintained the balance of Mat, the cosmic principle of truth and order. If he upheld justice, the sun rose in harmony. If he failed, the world tilted toward chaos. This belief created an astonishing stability. Rebellion became a cosmic violation. Loyalty became a moral duty. Every brick of every pyramid carried the weight of that idea. The king's immortality was not symbolic. It was engineered into stone. Yet this fusion of power and the sacred had consequences. Any system that blends religion and authority risks becoming absolute. When a ruler embodies the divine, questioning him becomes unthinkable. Criticism becomes sacrilege. Law becomes unquestionable because it represents heaven. And inequality becomes destiny. This is visible across early states. In Mesopotamia, temple estates expanded until they controlled enormous tracts of farmland. In Egypt, vast labor forces built monumental tombs, not for the living but for eternal kings. In the Levant and Anatolia, rulers adopted divine titles to secure their position in a competitive world. But the most significant consequence was psychological. When kings claimed the power to define what was sacred, they also claimed the power to define what was true. What was moral? What was just? Control of meaning became the deepest form of control. People obeyed not out of fear, but because they believed the universe itself demanded it. They labored not only for survival, but for cosmic purpose. They accepted hierarchy because hierarchy reflected the structure of creation. And for a time, this system worked. Cities grew. Trade flourished. Monumental architecture reached its golden age. Civilization appeared stable, eternal, ordained. But beneath the grandeur, questions were forming. If rulers were divine, why did they die? If law came from heaven, why did it sometimes benefit the powerful more than the weak? If gods resembled people, could their stories be interpreted differently? Could they be wrong? Could humans understand morality without them? These questions did not yet challenge the foundations of kingship. But they introduced something new into the ancient world. The idea that truth might not come from authority, but from reflection. That quiet shift was the first crack in the fusion of divinity and power. A crack that would grow as societies became larger, wealthier, and more complex. And through that crack would emerge a revolution not of armies or temples, but of thought. As divine kingship reached its height and rulers claimed the authority to define truth itself, something subtle but transformative began moving beneath the surface of ancient societies. People started thinking. Not just obeying. Not just participating in ritual. But questioning, comparing, interpreting, wondering. This was not rebellion. It was reflection. In the earliest civilizations, truth had been singular. What the gods willed, rulers declared, and temples enforced. There was no separation between cosmic order and political order. But once myths became psychological and gods took on human emotions, people saw that the divine was not a fixed blueprint. It was a story shaped by those who told it. That realization opened a space for thought. Across Mesopotamia, scribes copied myths, hymns, and legal codes, while also writing proverbs, debates, and reflections. Clay tablets preserve arguments about justice, questions about destiny, stories of righteous sufferers, and parables about the limits of power. These early writings show a world beginning to examine itself. One Sumerian dialogue asks why the good suffer while the wicked prosper. Another questions whether the gods truly reward loyalty. These were not acts of defiance. They were attempts to understand moral logic beyond authority. Egypt experienced its own wave of introspection. During periods of instability, scribes composed texts like the Dialogue of a Man with His Soul and the Instruction of Merikari. These works explored despair, responsibility, leadership, and the burden of decision. Pharaoh was still divine, but even divine kings needed wisdom. Authority required reflection, not only ritual. In the Levant, a different development emerged. Nomadic and semi-nomadic societies, lacking monumental temples, focused belief on covenant and conscience rather than structure. The sacred moved inward. Morality became a relationship rather than a building. Justice was no longer tied only to kingship but to communal identity. These intellectual shifts did not overthrow the ancient world. They enriched it. People still honored their gods, obeyed kings, and relied on temples. But beneath the visible order, a new kind of authority was forming. The authority of thought. Writing accelerated this transformation. Once ideas were preserved on clay and papyrus, people could compare the present to the past. They could see contradictions, failures, and lessons. A ruler who claimed a divine mandate could be measured against earlier rulers. A law that enforced fairness could be judged against its own principles. Culture became self-aware. Temples continued to define cosmic order, but people now recognized that interpretation was human. Kings continued to claim divine sanction, but their actions could be evaluated morally, not just ritually. Gods continued to shape myth, but myth now revealed truths about the human mind. As reflection deepened, so did doubt. Not destructive doubt, but analytical doubt. The kind that asks why, not whether to obey. The kind that seeks meaning, not rebellion. In this new intellectual environment, stories acquired layers. The Epic of Gilgamesh, copied for centuries, transformed from a tale of a king's glory into a meditation on mortality, friendship, and purpose. The Egyptian Book of the Dead evolved from a manual for the afterlife into a guide for moral living. Canaanite myths emphasized loyalty, compassion, and truth as sacred obligations. People were no longer looking only for divine intervention. They were looking for understanding. They wanted to know what made life meaningful, what made justice real, what made a leader worthy. Faith was no longer passive. It had become interpretive. This shift prepared the ancient world for something unprecedented. A new form of power would soon rise, not from temples or kings, but from ideas that questioned both. Ideas that sought universal principles rather than divine commands. Ideas that examined existence, not just obedience. Ideas that turned reflection into philosophy. The stage was set. Civilization had learned to obey. Now it was learning to think. And once societies began to think, they would eventually ask the most dangerous question of all. What if truth does not belong to the gods or the kings, but to us? Civilization had grown vast. Temples managed grain and time. Kings embodied the sacred. Laws shaped behavior. Myths taught morality. And yet, beneath all this order, something far more subtle had begun to stir. A second kind of world was forming. Not built from clay or stone, but from thought. For thousands of years, humans had obeyed the voices of gods, kings, and tradition because survival demanded it. But once the divine took human form and law took written form, something new became possible. People could compare. They could reflect. They could remember. Memory once carried by ritual and elders was now stored in tablets, scrolls, inscriptions. Knowledge no longer died when a storyteller died. It stayed. It accumulated. It invited questions. And questions are seeds. As cities prospered, those seeds began to sprout in surprising places. In the quiet rooms of scribes who copied myths again and again, noticing patterns and contradictions. In the minds of priests who observed the stars, not only for ritual, but for curiosity. In the hearts of workers who carved stories into temple walls and wondered why the gods behaved so much like themselves. Every tablet pressed, every measurement taken, every hymn repeated added a new layer to human self-awareness. Civilization had not only built temples of stone. It had built temples of thought. Even in the most rigid kingdoms, cracks of introspection appeared. A judge hesitated when two laws conflicted. A priest wondered whether a ritual failed because the god was silent, or because the world was changing. A ruler questioned whether divine mandate alone could hold a city together. These moments were small, almost invisible. But they were the first signs of a new kind of power, one that did not come from gods or kings, but from imagination. Imagination had always existed, of course. It built myths, shaped rituals, inspired monuments. But now it turned inward. Instead of only asking how the world worked, humans began asking why. Why order mattered. Why justice needed to be fair. Why some truths felt universal, stronger than any law or ruler. This inward turn changed the ancient world more than any conquest. Because once people realized they could question meaning itself, meaning no longer belonged solely to the temples. It lived in debate, in story, in reflection, in the fragile but powerful ability to imagine a world different from the one inherited. This did not destroy religion or kingship. It enriched them. It created advisors who guided rulers toward wisdom instead of flattery. It fostered traditions of teaching, copying, arguing, refining. It allowed myths to evolve, rituals to adapt, communities to rethink what it meant to live well. Imagination became the quiet architect of change. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Anatolia to the Levant, new ideas began drifting along trade routes just like grain and copper. A proverb carried across a desert. A hymn shared between sailors. A story retold by merchants around a fire. Ideas traveled faster than armies. And unlike kingdoms, they did not fall when a city burned. The earth watched as humans, for the first time, began building futures not only with their hands, but with their minds. They planned beyond the harvest. They dreamed beyond the next flood. They looked at the world not as something imposed upon them, but as something they could shape. This was the true beginning of tomorrow. Not in temples or palaces, but in the human capacity to imagine what had never existed before. Civilization had mastered water, stone, and law. Now it was preparing to master possibility. And with that shift, the ancient world stood on the edge of something extraordinary. A leap that would carry humanity from obedience to vision, from ritual to thought, from fear to imagination. The foundations were set. The world was ready. What came next would not be built by kings or gods, but by ideas powerful enough to outlive both. The dreams that would shape the future had already begun to form. Echoes of Sapiens. If stories like this remind you what it means to be human, subscribe and keep exploring with us.